Hello everyone and welcome back to another layout update. So it's been quite a while since my last layout update. In fact, it's been over a year, and I figured, it's probably time to get an update out there to show you what progress has been made on the layout in the last several months. And as always, as most of us are aware, life gets in the way. As I always say in my videos, I started a new job earlier this year, which has taken a lot of my time and energy away from the layout, and I've been investing it in that, on top of many other factors, which has kind of taken my motivation to work on the layout away for extended periods of time, etc., etc. But in any case, I have done some stuff to the layout and made some progress in some various ways, most recently in the last few months. So without any further ado, let's take a look at what's been done on the layout, what kind of new things I've purchased and to add to the prototype, and let's just go check it out. So most of the things that I've done on the layouts over the last year have been primarily on the branch line and grade side of things, and one of the first things I'm showing you here is just a new track alignment that I installed at the grain elevator. And the reason for that is because throughout the pandemic I started to take a particular interest into modeling prototypical grain trains, and primarily on the Canadian National Railroad. So I needed a little bit more track space and a little bit more of an efficient operation for what I had in mind to handle the number of cars that I had kind of collected since the pandemic started. I think it's one of those things that I kind of fell in the trap of, was buying repeatedly rather than actually working on the layout, because it was just easier to do that when you don't necessarily have the time to actually invest in the layout. So, but in any case, it's quite a bit different actually since the last layout update. Before, these two tracks here were just stub end, and they fit about 6, 7, 8 cars each, and they were just you would just reverse into those tracks and leave them there and then pull them out and take them away when you're ready. How that's changed is this track here is actually now a through track, and so is this track here, and then the track closest to the wall, it is a stub end, and as you can see, it holds about 7 cars still, and nothing's changed there. I'm not sure exactly what that leaving that stub end track necessarily models. I think for my operations, from an operations perspective, I'm probably going to leave it as like an import grain that came up from the States, or in this case it'll be coming up from staging, which is kind of the primary idea behind the staging, is a Burlington Northern interchange. So that's maybe where I'd park the import grain, and then the rest of the unit grain trains on the layout from CN and CP will be the run-through tracks. So essentially what that allows me to do now is I bring a train into the arrival departure, which I added a second arrival departure track, or I should say arrival track now. So there's 2 sidings for trains that are arriving at the grain silos, which hold about a 12-car train. And then when they drop the cars, or when the cars are dropped from the inbound, they can take the outbound grain and just run around their string of cars and latch on to the unloaded set of grain cars in here and take it off to the yard. Now that said, that's primarily a transfer job that comes from the yard over onto the branch line. However, that's kind of the idea behind the track alignment changes that I made. Just a little bit more efficient, less maneuvers to kind of simulate a larger grain operation in the grand scheme of things. Now, another track alignment change I made was down at the very end of this branch line kind of industrial area. And I mean, I've changed the track alignment down here probably dozens of times at this point, so that's nothing really new. However, I wasn't really happy with the way the switches were laid out and how it looked, and I was shorting myself some space with the switches I used. So before, at the transload facility, there was a curved turnout in here, which took up quite a lot of space. As a result, I took that out, put a smaller number 4 switch in, which increased track length by at least a car. And I was able to do that by removing, I had like a set of crossovers in here because my original idea was to have a module for op sessions only that extended out through the door into the hallway for people to set up their rolling stock and locomotives. And what that crossover allowed for was to have this track here close to the window, the main line that would shoot through to the module, and then this track here would be the siding to allow for an inbound train to pull in, uncouple, and start switching industries. I've since steered away from that because I'm finding that, one, I don't host a lot of op sessions, so therefore there's no real need for it, and I have more than enough space to really just set up on the layout. I have more than enough of my own rolling stock and locomotives, so that's not really a concern to me anymore. So I finally come to the conclusion that this is just going to be a dead end sort of portion of the layout. This is the end of the line for this portion. It's a industrial switching zone only, and essentially the underlevel staging, which I still haven't got to, will replace that module that was once out in the hallway. So like I said, I removed the crossover and then I replaced it with a Y switch, which increased the lead by just a little bit, not a whole lot, but it increased the lead by probably about a locomotive length, which was helpful at times when people are running the grain trains down at this end. So yeah, just a couple minor track alignment changes, and I think overall it's kind of improved the operations down at this end of the layout. So aside from the minor track alignment changes, the biggest project that I've been working on over the last probably about 2 months now is the grade from the lower level to the upper level. And this is just a portion of it because obviously I have a helix. However, my biggest concern right now is getting this portion of the layout scenic. And that's because a few life events have resulted in me not really knowing how much longer I'm going to have this layout. So for me, I think it's really important to get some scenery underway and get a portion of the layout scenic so that I can enjoy it a little bit more, and for my YouTube channel's sake, film a scenic portion of the layout and make it look realistic, etc., rather than just the standard plywood, foam, and painter's paper and cardboard that I've been looking at for the last year and a half. So let's take a look at what I've done and what I'm doing to this portion of the layout, and I'll kind of do a little bit of explaining as to what's going on here. So if you've been following my channel for a little while, you'll know that my scenery technique that I'm using is kind of one that's been used for many years. However, I'll just give a brief explanation of how I do it. I have the extruded foam sub-scenery supports, which essentially is just the kind of the support for all of this sub-scenery that you see here. So I carve foam, I hot glue it into place, and it kind of provides me like a large, broad scope of what the mountains and elevation and everything's going to look like. From there, I connect each foam support with a cardboard webbing technique, which has been used in model railroading for many, many years. And then I cover that cardboard webbing with painter's paper, and I just hot glue it to the cardboard webbing, and then that really kind of finalizes and really gives me a good sense of what the landscape and the contours are all going to look like. Now, some people leave it at that. Some people will just paint it or cover it with a very thin layer of plaster in some areas, and then just go about covering the rest of it with different scenery materials. What I'm doing a little bit differently, and this is probably just because I'm over-engineering it, is I've covered the painter's paper, and excuse the shadow from my mic here, but I have covered the painter's paper with yet another layer, and that's a layer of plaster cloth. Just a single layer of plaster cloth to give it the rigidity that I need in order to plant trees in it, and more importantly for this section of the layout at least, carve rocks. So I'm gonna once again reposition the tripod, and I'll do a little bit more explaining on how I'm going about the rock formations, etc. So once everything was covered in plaster cloth, it gave me a really good solid foundation to start carving rocks on. The problem without covering it with plaster cloth was just the paper is a little bit too flimsy, the cardboard still has a little bit of give in it, and it doesn't really give anything for the plaster of Paris to really latch onto. So that's the reasoning behind putting the plaster cloth down first, is it gives something for the plaster of Paris to grip into. I originally started by casting rocks using the Woodland Scenics rock molds and the lightweight hydrocal and all those products that are available on the market. I started to steer away from that basically as soon as I started carving rocks, because I found that I would be casting rocks for many months to get what I needed in order to do all the rock formations for this entire section of the layout. There are rock castings kind of implanted here and there to add a little bit of variety and at least use the rock castings that I created. And I'll actually just show you. Down here is the box. And it's almost completely full of various rock castings that I did over about a week or two time span. But anyway, I steered away from the rock casting because I was finding they weren't planting into the scene as well as I had anticipated, and it was just becoming a bit of a hassle. So I switched to carving my own rocks, and unfortunately I cannot remember the YouTube channel that I found this technique on. However, I believe he's a European gentleman who's modeling I think almost like maybe the Tehachapi loops. In any case, I used his technique to hand carve all of my own rocks. And basically that just involves mixing a batch of plaster of Paris and shaping it and carving it the way that you want it to look until it is completely solidified. So you'll kind of be able to see the progression of my rock castings, and as I went along I got a little bit better, less picky with like how I wanted the rocks to look. It looks less uniform, looks more uniform at the start and kind of animated, whereas further down the line, further down the end of the room here, they'll look a little bit more natural. So this section here was actually my very first, these were my very first rock castings, and as you can tell, it's very animated. It's very carved out, and there's a lot of vertical lines, and it's fairly smooth, and there's not a lot of texture and contour to them. So I mean, not bad for my first try, but I'm probably going to go back and at least add or redo that portion because I think it looks a little bit cartoonish. And then my second batch of rock castings was this section here, and it looks a little bit more natural, but it also kind of looks a little bit messy in my opinion, and still a little bit of animated in some sense. So I'm going to take the camera off the tripod for this portion because I'll have to do like 60 clips to show you all of the sections of rock that I've done so far. So I'm just going to do a quick bypass of everything and show you how far I've got with carving my rocks. So as I had mentioned, I'd started down here near the swing gates and gradually worked my way along the lower half of the grade. And you can kind of tell like here and here and a couple other places there are the precast rock formations from Woodland Scenics, or sorry, from the rock molds from Woodland Scenics that I cast. And to come along here, you can see the rocks start to look a little bit more natural as we go along and as I progressed in my techniques, and got a little bit better at it. It looks kind of all out of sorts, and you know, doesn't look particularly nice right now because everything's white and nothing's colored, and there's no definition in the rocks because of that. So it looks subpar right now. I think it's going to look a lot better once I get some color on there and some different textures and slides and you know, loose rock, etc. You can see in some areas I've left open patches where I'm going to simulate, you know, scree slopes where there's no actual rock formations. It's all loose rock and gravel that is separated from the original formation. And this scene here I think is going to end up looking really good once I get the bridge in, which I'm actually currently building a kit for that. And this section here is kind of the latest area that I worked on. As you can see, it's still a bit of a mess with all the chipped rock. And the nice thing about making your own rock formations is you end up with your own talus at the end of it. And I've been saving all of the chipped pieces of rock in these old Woodland Scenic Scenery bottles because they're going to be perfect for when I go to model the scree slopes. So I kind of make my own gravel in a sense. Some of this will need to be mashed up a little bit more and made into finer bits, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm kind of reusing what I've already created, and I think that'll be that'll kind of add to the scene. And then this area here is a little bit tough because this is an access panel, so I'm not really too sure how I'm going to hide this yet. It's going to be a challenge, and I think that's a challenge that a lot of people face when having these access panels, because it's very difficult to blend all the plaster and make it look like a seamless transition. In any case, I'm not overly concerned about that because when I'm filming this section, one, there will be more trees and more scenery distracting you from the lines that you can see in the access panel. And then kind of the same idea here. I've left big open patches for huge scree slopes. You can see like this is supposed to simulate that the mountain goes way up, so there's lots more rock formations and lots of slide areas when, you know, there's snow on in different seasons. When it's snowing, you know, slides and ice and freezing and expanding, contracting result in lots of loose rocks and gravel. So that's kind of what I'm going to model here again. I didn't do any rock castings in this area because I'm going to be building kind of like an exposed tunnel portal here to kind of blend this corner in just a little bit. I don't like how the kind of the angles at which I've built the mountain. I think it looks kind of doesn't look very natural. And then that's kind of the same with this section here. I think it looks like I tried too hard to fit a tunnel into the scene. So I'm going to do like a cement slide shed here, similar to what you see at Gold Pan Provincial Park in the Fraser Canyon or the Thompson Canyon. And then that'll allow me to build the scenery out and make this more of a gradual sort of curve rather than the 90-degree angles that you see currently. And I have to do the same, unfortunately, on this side as well. So with that said, all I really have to do now is the upper portion of the grade and somehow blend the rocks into these large walls, because it's I think some days I look at it and I think I went a little bit too high. I think it looks a little bit disproportionate, but I'm confident I'll be able to blend it in and make it, you know, look half decent at the end of the day. So that's basically what's going on this portion of the layout. I'm hoping to have at least some color on the rocks and start scenicking this area by Christmas, but we shall see how that all plays out, because I tend to get distracted from modeling at times, as we all do. So another area that I worked on over the last couple months was this bridge scene on the upper level just before the entrance to the yard. And I didn't really have to work too hard on this, because this model, or this bridge in front of you, is actually a BLMA brass model, and these come basically ready to run, ready to install right on the layout. They come fully detailed, fully built right out of the box. The downside of that is the price that you have to pay for them, not to mention that they're a brass model, and they are kind of hard to come by these days. So had to pay a fair amount for that model, but I think that it fits the scene perfectly. I originally had intended on modeling this scene kind of like the bridge in Revelstoke, for those who are familiar with that. However, the scene that or the amount of space that I allotted to do that scene is probably 1/8, if not less, of the actual space that would be required to model that and kind of represent it in the way that it is, because it is a very long bridge. And then obviously that was a completely different bridge style. I was originally going to do a girder style bridge through and through, but I think this looks much better in the end. The only thing I really have to do now is build more permanent supports and get a couple girder platforms for either end to really draw or pull the scene together, and then obviously some plaster and scenery and water, etc., etc. So there's a lot of work to do on this scene yet, but in any case, I have a bridge in there, and it's kind of representing what this scene is going to look like in the future. So yeah, that is all of the progress that I've made on the layout over the last year. I know it's pretty crazy considering it's been quite a long time since my last layout update, but I'm not going to go over everything, but lots of stuff has gotten in the way over the last little while. So in addition to the work that I've done on the layout, I've also been doing a lot of modeling on the workbench and purchasing different locomotives, detailing them, doing sound and DCC installs for friends. So that has taken a lot of time away from working on the layout, but it's been good because I'm enjoying that work and doing the detailing, etc. So now let's jump into some of the new purchases that I've made, some of the cool projects that I've worked on over the last little bit in the locomotive fleet, and yeah, just kind of show you a few other things I've been working on. As I mentioned earlier in this video, over the last year, 2 years, I've taken a very large interest in modeling Canadian National grain trains. So as a result, I've made a lot of purchases that reflect those grain trains that Canadian National hauls. So that involves a lot of miscellaneous grain cars that have been patched and leased, etc., and a lot of the cylindrical grain hoppers as well that were seen in these CN grain trains. So lots of purchases. I'm not going to show you every single one because we'll be here for an hour, but this is just one CN grain train which I'm actually going to be sending off to get weathered by Rob Arsenault here in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. And while we're on the topic of grain cars and sending them off to get weathered by Rob Arsenault, I was going to do a quick pass by of a train that I've already sent him, and as well as some additional cars that I've bought off him that he has weathered. And originally I was weathering my own grain cars, and I still do some of my own weathering. However, it has come down to a time thing more than anything, and I just don't have the time to weather the cars. On top of that, I think Rob does a fantastic job at representing the modern CN grain fleet, and he really accurately depicts that in his weathering jobs. I have a few other cars scattered around the layout that have been weathered by him, and every piece of work that I've purchased off of him, I've been absolutely floored by. So I highly recommend sending your models to him to get weathered. I don't think you'll regret it one bit. I definitely didn't. I've become pretty good friends with Rob over the last couple of years, and yeah, just super happy with his work, and it's well worth the money, and probably one of my most favorite rail cars that I've purchased from him is this Athen Genesis car. It's a new release. It's in an FURX patch, but he weathered it up fantastically. So just a few examples of the flawless work that he does on a regular basis, and yeah, it's my little sales pitch to him. I think he very much deserves an excellent review. So in addition to the large-scale purchasing of grain cars, I also got into modeling a different train, which I honestly thought I wouldn't ever model, and for a while I was actually phasing out the cars that I had originally purchased because I found that they just looked too big, bulky, and disproportionate compared to everything else. And I mean, they are like that in real life and on the one-to-one scale. However, just for modeling purposes, I wasn't a huge fan of them until recently. And those are the AutoRacks. Now, a little bit of this purchase had to do with not necessarily the investment side. However, I think that Intermountain has done a really, really good job on modeling these AutoRacks with the see-through grills, the detail. Like, they're just awesome looking cars. And what I noticed is when I actually wanted to finally start purchasing them, one, they were incredibly hard to find, and when you did find them, they were incredibly overpriced. So when the most recent run of them was released by Intermountain, I bit the bullet and I purchased a handful of these Intermountain AutoRacks and to build a train. And with the length of these cars, it doesn't take a lot of them to make up a full train, at least on my layout. Most train lengths vary between 12 to 15 cars. I think the AutoRack train is about 8 or 9 cars. So they're quite a bit longer, quite a bit more bulky, but I have a train of them now that I am also using to mix in with other freights. In addition to the Intermountain cars, I also bought a couple of those Gunnarsson style AutoRacks from, I think I actually have one from Atlas and Scale Trains. So in any case, I'm not really planning on purchasing many more, maybe 1 or 2. However, just kind of a neat model that has been produced by Intermountain and even Scale Trains. So one of the purchases and projects that I had completed over the last couple of months is this Overland Models Canadian National SD40U. And most people are aware, but there's no plastic models that have been done that accurately represent the SD40U. So that's why I kind of bit the bullet and ended up working out a deal and purchased one of these SD40Us. It came just standard, kind of the ready-to-run version of Overland Models, which is just straight DC incandescent bulbs. And you might remember from my last layout update that I'd been in the process of switching all of my locomotives from various different sound manufacturers over to ESU. And that's what I did with this locomotive. I stripped it down, I cleaned it out completely, lubricated all of the gears, and did LEDs, sound, and speaker upgrades in this locomotive. So now it runs wonderfully on the layout. As I mentioned, I put LEDs in the unit, so ditch lights, headlight, as well as rear headlight, rear ditch lights, and the standard ESU sound. It's awesome. I'm a huge fan of ESU, especially with their loc programmer. So this model is a really, really cool addition to the fleet, and can be used for various tasks around the layout. Standard horn, bell, and then the prime mover we're all pretty much aware of. So I also picked up a few other units, and the ones that you're looking at in front of you are from Scale Trains. These are 2 of their recent runs of in the background here you have a ET44AC, and it has the Aboriginal logo as well as the white roof and the 100th anniversary logo on the long hood. That unit I particularly like for the white roof. I think it's kind of a neat feature that CN has been doing on a lot of their newer locomotives and repaints. And then in front of it is just a standard ES44AC in the 2800 series, and I actually picked up two of these. These are fairly predominant on the Canadian National Railroad. They run up into the 2900 series, and I think even the 3800 series for the Tier 4 credit units. With that aside, I picked up two of these units because they, once again, just accurately reflect what I see regularly on the railroad. So, standard quality from Scale Trains. It's awesome. The detail is awesome. They run great. I've had no issues whatsoever with any quality control or missing detail parts, etc. I've just been blown away by Scale Trains since day one, and I quite frankly love their products. So once again, these are two super cool models that they've released, and I'm also particularly happy that they're paying attention to the Canadian market and what's needed for the Canadian railroads. And their most recent announcement is the CN-9s, which have not been accurately produced in plastic either. You could get it in a ready-to-roll version with missing lots of details and not particularly accurate to the Canadian prototype, or you could buy it in brass before. So it's two different models that you could purchase before Scale Trains announced the -9s, and they were kind of completely polar opposites on the spectrum. So super happy about Scale Trains and everything that they're doing for the Canadian prototypes, and I'm looking forward to their future releases that are catering to the Canadian market. Another unit here that I actually purchased a while ago and may have even been seen on previous layout updates is this Athen Genesis GP38-2 here. This model is actually one that I undertook as a pretty significant project, and the reason being is because when I bought it, it did not at all look like this. This was originally an Illinois Central GP38-2 in the Illinois Central as delivered colors. And what I did with this model was I stripped it apart, stripped the paint completely off of it, and then I had to go back and paint it and redetail a lot of it. Unfortunately, in the paint stripping process, you tend to lose a few details here and there, so I had to go back and make those adjustments and fix what was missing. And the biggest thing was painting this model. I have never had experience in the past with painting any models, especially when it comes to a locomotive where the paint really just has to be flawless, otherwise you're going to really notice it. And luckily I didn't have to paint any of the decals or the stripes or anything. I actually got custom decals made for this locomotive, including the unit number and some of the safety decals, etc., etc. This is actually what the unit looks like today. It was repainted many years ago, so I wanted to update the model, which was originally Illinois Central 9601, which is the model that I bought, and I basically just upgraded the paint scheme to the CN/IC 9601 that it is today. This model also received LED sound and speaker upgrades. I'm not going to bore you with that, and in fact I actually just found out that I have a programming issue with this locomotive because it's not responding to anything, but in any case it has all of the upgrades that I have been doing to all of my other locomotives as well. So I'm super happy with the way this locomotive turned out. I would say for a first paint job it's not too bad at all. The only thing that kind of bothers me about it is, and this comes down to just learning and experimenting, but I used a white primer to prime the locomotive before I painted it, and I think that a lot of manufacturers must use a gray primer because with the white primer, the red on this locomotive came out quite a bit more vibrant than most other manufacturers. Not that that really matters, considering most paint that's used on locomotives today varies in color a little bit depending on the batch anyway. So that's more of just a critique for my work, as I typically do with most of my work anyway. So, but yeah, overall, couldn't be more happy with this locomotive. I think for a first paint job, I think it turned out really well. So just another little cool model to add to the fleet, and a different paint variation. Well, I figured I've probably bored you enough with my rambling and explanation on the topics that we've covered throughout this layout update. So that's basically it. That's all I have to show you today. I know it's not as much progress, especially for an entire year, as I've shown previously. However, it kind of is what it is. Aside from making the progress that I've made over the last year, I've been up here quite a bit, but more so in the capacity of just running trains, having some friends over, having a beer, running trains, talking, and just the more social elements. And I think that's super important right now, considering that most of the world is still in this COVID pandemic emergency, and we're not really able to get out into the public and socialize. So having that close group of friends come over, a couple at a time, to run trains and just relax is always quite a pleasure. So as we approach the new year and into the new year, I'm hoping to make quite a bit more progress on the layout, especially on the scene on the grade. So I'd like to complete that hopefully by the new year, and if not, the very early stages of the new year, so I can have some nice scenic photogenic areas on the layout that I can use to basically give you more videos and add some production value to the layout. So and with all that said, that concludes today's layout update. If you have any comments or questions, concerns, whatever, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. I'll be happy to answer them when I can get to them. If you enjoy the content of today's video, I always encourage to drop a thumbs up, and definitely encourages me to make more videos and keep producing content for you guys. I know it's been a bit of a drag over the last year, however, it's the way things go sometimes. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you right here at my layout next time.